Hello and welcome to Real Crime UK. Here we bring you an update on the convictions following the recent string of violent riots that have shocked communities across the UK. Following the tragic events in Southport, demonstrations took place across the UK with a number descending into rioting and clashes between protesters and police. What began as peaceful demonstrations following tragic events in Southport quickly descended into chaos, with rioters clashing with police, looting shops and causing widespread damage. The unrest left communities in the shock and authorities scrambling to restore order. The authorities have now arrested dozens of individuals involved in these chaotic scenes, including rioters, looters and online agitators. As of today, over 40 individuals have been arrested for their involvement in the riots. The charges range from public order offences to theft and incitement to violence and inciting of violence through social media platforms. Here are the people charged so far in relation to these offences. David Wilkinson, 72 months in prison, violent disorder, attempted arson and racially aggravated criminal damage. Daniel Russell, 32 months in prison, violent disorder. Curtis Coulson, 4.5 months in prison, violent disorder. Connor Whiteley, 36 months in prison, violent disorder and assaulting an emergency worker. Cole Stewart, 18 months in Young Offenders Institute, violent disorder. Christopher Taggart and Reese McDonald, 32 months in prison, publishing written material to stir up racial hatred. Billy Pemberton, 28 months in prison, violent disorder. Amo Lead, 20 months in prison, violent disorder. Aaron Bradshaw, Ben Judge, Norman Ahmed and Jonathan Ambrose, 30 months in prison, violent disorder. Dominic Capaldi, 34 months in prison, violent disorder. Drew Jarvis, 36 months in prison, violent disorder. Dylan Carey, 18 months in prison, violent disorder. Elliot Ragg, 32 months in prison, violent disorder. Gary Harkness, 12 months in prison, violent disorder. Lynn Guest, 32 months in prison, violent disorder. Guy Sullivan, 36 months in prison, violent disorder. Ian Bettier, 18 months in prison, violent disorder. Ian Ward, 18 months in prison, affray, assault and assaulting a police officer. John Cann, 36 months in prison, violent disorder. John England, 20 months in prison, using threatening, abusive and insulting words to stir up racial hatred. John Honey, 56 months in prison, violent disorder and burglary. Joseph Lay, 38 months in prison, violent disorder. Julie Sweeney, 15 months in prison, sending a communication to convey a threat of death or serious harm. Kane Hicks, 32 months in prison, violent disorder. Kerry Gove, Andrew Ball and Graham Brady, 18 to 30 months in prison, violent disorder. Kevin Searle, 21 months in prison, violent disorder and assault by beating of an emergency worker. Lee James, 12 months in prison, violent disorder. Mark Bowen, 25 months in prison, violent disorder. Michael Whitehead, 32 months in prison, violent disorder. Oliver Chapman, 20 months in prison, violent disorder. Paul Dixon, 4 months in prison, using threatening, abusive or insulting words or behaviour. Paul Smith, 34 months in prison, violent disorder. Paul Williams, 26 months in prison, violent disorder. Philip Hoban, 8 months in prison, causing racially aggravated harassment, alarm or distress. Reese Greenwood, 30 months in prison, violent disorder. Ricky Hardman, 32 months in prison, violent disorder. Riley Addy, 24 months in Young Offenders, unknown charge. Roger Haywood, 30 months in prison, violent disorder. Ryan Bailey, 36 months in prison, violent disorder. Ryan Wheatley, 12 months in prison, violent disorder. Stuart Bolton, 32 months in prison, unknown charge. Thomas Rogers, 26 months in prison, violent disorder and possession of an offensive weapon. Trevor Lloyd, 36 months in prison, unknown charge. Further convictions are expected as authorities have vowed to continue their crackdown on those responsible for the riots. The government has announced new measures aimed at preventing such events in the future, including stricter controls on online content that incites violence and enhanced policing in vulnerable areas. The riots have left a lasting mark on communities across the UK, but with these arrests, authorities hope to send a clear message that such actions will not go unpunished. As the nation moves forward, it's crucial to address the root causes of these disturbances and work towards a more peaceful and just society.